Is responsible for marketing of in-building wireless systems, including DAS systems and high-capacity Wi-Fi. With 2 decades of experience, Swank has comprehensive technical expertise in wireless, as well as multiple vertical markets, including healthcare. Swank has held leadership positions in project management, product marketing, business development, and software development in numerous high-tech companies, including Interwireless, Nortel, and NEC. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Swank.
Whatever happens, happens. All right, so the good news or the bad news is that we've been reduced to an hour. So I don't know if we can cover A to Z in an hour, but we'll try. So a couple of things. So A to Z. So what we thought about, we could do 26 questions about DAS, which would be really fun, but we couldn't come up with anything that started with Z. So if you come up with something that starts with Z, let us know, and we'll try to go for it. So I would like to introduce the panel first of all. So on my right is Douglas Dimitroff. He's a partner at Phillips Lytle, and he leads the telecom business practice. And then we have Dan Harkness, who's the director of sales at Advanced RF Technologies, and he's focused on the DAS strategy there. And then we have Matt Melester. Matt's the senior VP at CommScope, leading the distributed coverage and capacity solutions global team. And Teri Goodwin, she's the business development manager at AT&T for the Antenna Solutions Group. She hangs out at the AT&T table right in the back if you're looking for them. And then we have John Spindler, and John is the VP of product management for TE Connectivity, and he's responsible for the wireless product portfolio, and he's probably been in this business longer than most of us. All right. So A to Z. So what we are going to cover is we're going to cover basically start to finish of getting a DAS. So what kind of venues qualify for a DAS? What are some of the business models? And some of that, we started some of that discussion this morning, and it quickly got very, very interesting with respect to what are the business models and how are they evolving, and we'll try to cover some of that. Issuing an RFP and procuring a DAS. And then all the way to installation and post-installation of a DAS. So we're going to try to cover those 4 topics in kind of 15-minute increments, and we're off and running. All right, so starting with the venue that needs a DAS. So we all flipped a coin, and Matt won. So Matt gets to start. So Matt, and we're going to do this as a Q&A, and if somebody just has a burning question, raise your hand, and we'll try to fit it into the session. So we'll start off. Building characteristics, both physical and usage. So where's a DAS? Where is it required? When is DAS used versus like some of the other small cell solutions we've been starting to talk about?
Where was I when you flipped that coin?
It was a virtual coin that we did over the conference.
Well, I think a lot's changed in the last couple of years. I mean, it used to be we put in-building coverage where there wasn't coverage at all, but now it's really about capacity. So that changes a lot of where we put these things in. So capacity first started, the big key driver for this onslaught of DAS over the last few years was in these public access venues, sporting arenas, football stadiums, basketball arenas, airports, and the nature like that. So DAS right now is a very effective solution for offloading the macro network, so it really applies pretty much across the board. I think the verticals in the order of priority have been the sports venues, the entertainment complexes like casinos, but now it's moving into the enterprise space more, into the university space, and I think it just will continue to progress until we have all these venues adequately covered.
Okay. Do you see anything like from a square footage perspective? You mentioned capacity. Do you see anything from a certain number of users in a facility before DAS makes sense?
Well, as far as priority, it really goes where the priorities, from my perspective, and both from what I see in the market and both as an equipment manufacturer, they start with where there's a high concentration of people, because that's where the capacity really is. And from an equipment supplier, that's where the dollars really are. But I think DAS applies even to the smaller ones. I don't think I've seen as great of increase in the smaller enterprise space as I have with the larger verticals.
Okay. All right. So, Mr. John. So I think one of the things that we hear a lot of, and it's still prevalent in the marketplace, is, especially as we even move towards new technologies, but like still hear about passive DAS, still hear words like active, hybrid. What's your take on that? Can you give us a little bit of information on what those are? And I know you can because you wrote a great article that just came out in the Bixie magazine on the topic. So.
And there's another one in the Akuta magazine. You missed that. Yeah, sure, great. I think to piggyback on Matt's comments, I believe that in years past, all the way back 5 whole years ago, what DAS was all about was just coverage. And we've had this incredible phenomenon of capacity requirement really exploding in the networks from the use of smartphones and more data. So that has also shifted what the requirements are in terms of the kinds of solutions that you're providing to meet those needs. So historically I always like to bring this with me because I can keep Kevin in line too with this thing. Passive DAS. So passive DAS, and I kind of feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir here in the room, but passive DAS is traditionally some kind of a RF source, a repeater or a base station driving coaxial cable. So that's why it's passive. There's no really active components in it. You'll see lots and lots of this half-inch coax, extremely flexible stuff, right? 7-foot bend radius on this stuff. In the horizontal in a building, and you'll see 3/4 inch, 7/8 inch coax in the risers as well. Kind of a tried and true solution, doesn't break, there's no active electronics in it unless you have to put in inline amplifiers to boost the signal. But on the other side of the coin, and it's broadband, but on the other side of the coin, it tends to be very lossy. You have to take into account those cable run length losses, tough to design. And I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing domestically, and I think we're going to see it internationally, is a phase out of the use of passive DAS. It just doesn't work well from an LTE perspective. And when you go to MIMO, you're going to double the amount of this coax that you're putting in a building to get 2x2 MIMO with spatial antenna separation. And we just had a situation where a carrier came to us and they have a passive DAS in, and it's using GSM and LTE and UMTS, but basically the cost to upgrade that to LTE was so prohibitive, they're ripping all that coax out, or probably just leaving it in place in the building is probably helping reinforce the overall structure of that building, all that coax in there, and they're going to put active in that building because the cost was ridiculous to change out couplers and things. So from a more active perspective on the DAS, you have a couple of different things. You have a hybrid, what I like to call hybrid fiber coax. So this has an active head end where the RF source is coming in. It has a fiber component, so it's converting RF to optical. You're driving the optical over that fiber, long distances in some instances, 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers, whatever. Could be usually single mode fiber, sometimes multi-mode. And then from there, you have the last active element, which is generally an amplification point that's in a wiring closet somewhere. Now from there, you're still driving out half-inch coax to passive antenna elements. So you're getting a lot of extra boost from a performance perspective using this technology where you're actually going to fiber, but you do still have to worry about some of the losses in the coax and understand how you have to design the system based on the different coax runs. And then there's also all active DAS systems where there's actually the last active element in the DAS is right up next to the antenna point. So what that gives you is a system that's essentially zero loss and generally has better uplink performance, which is critical for data these days, all right? But that means you're going to a all fiber solution or fiber and something like Cat5 or CATV at the last leg of it. But zero loss, very good performance, but not always suited for every application. If you have high ceilings, you don't have to get up in those high ceilings and service that active element in the ceiling. Maybe it doesn't make good sense to put an active element up there. So those are the kinds of DAS solutions that are available today in the marketplace, and we're not even going to talk about picocells because that's a dirty word in my dictionary. So,
Great, great. All right, Teri. So we hear terms like, so here's more terms, single carrier solutions. We've talked, people are throwing around neutral host from an overall perspective, and maybe single carrier is the other dirty word now. And then we hear things about fire life safety. But just taking single carrier solutions versus neutral host, what are considerations that the carriers use in trying to make that determination?
So pretty much for AT&T, once we formed Antenna Solutions Group in 2010, our marching orders was neutral host. So on most cases, there are a few cases that we don't do neutral host, but most cases we do neutral host. Many reasons. One, from a financial perspective, allows you to share the infrastructure cost. And then secondly, of course, it allows for the venues and the tenants. They don't want to see multiple antennas, multiple real estate. There's not enough space in the closets and the IDF closets. So from the most case, AT&T is doing the neutral host. Cases where we do single carrier are only when there's a large sales opportunity for the sales team. So if the sales team is selling a lot of devices or services to that customer, then we might put a single carrier in, but otherwise we do all neutral host.
Okay, and then Dan, I'll let you tackle the fire life safety component. Should or should it not be included on a DAS?
Well, technically, I would normally say no, but that's not the appropriate answer for this group. Fire safety is really important to a lot of DAS applications. Unfortunately, the problem with fire safety in a lot of cases, it's a very it's difficult to fund, and it can also have some accountability and liability perspectives that make it a maybe not so desirable solution to try to deploy in a neutral host system. With that said, historically, like ADRF, we've done a lot of work with public safety. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping I can get some public safety leads while I'm here because we've got this wonderful product and we need more customers. So, but historically, fire safety has kind of been a small, very specific subset of your typical neutral host deployments, kind of for the reasons I mentioned before. From a funding perspective, people don't desire, something or really need it until something, an event occurs or, like the events that have happened over the past, year, these horrible tragedies and things that kind of get people's attention. But, as far as fire safety on a DAS system, it's not technologically difficult to deploy. It's that getting the money, getting a customer to put up funds to put that solution in. So, typically the entities that we sell to in the fire safety space are people who are, first responder type. So if you're, selling into a county or, putting a system in a jail, my counterparts kind of make fun of me because I spend so much time in jails. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things that we would like to see more of, and I think that the trend is going to be a lot more into public safety in the very near future, 700, 800 megahertz. So obviously something that's very important to us. So just as far as public safety goes, when you're trying to make considerations for that, I think the biggest thing are the technology, what frequencies are being used, what's the accountability? Does the municipality, do they have any sort of requirements for your system? Does it have to have some sort of a level of reliability? Or does it have to, be on all the time? Does it have to be 5 nines? Because if so, you can run into some trouble. And so also, I guess from an installation standpoint, we try to consider technology, the reliability, and of course trying to get the system to be funded.
So from a carrier perspective, just to add on to that, if there's a commercial DAS there and a public safety DAS, we want it, AT&T prefers it, and we want it as a separate layer, both from a financial and a liability standpoint.
Great, because I was going to ask you that question. Especially as we start to get into the business models, and I know there was some discussions earlier, so if there's some questions as we go through from the audience as we go through this section, then feel free to raise your hand. Okay.
So for the public safety type networks, how do you balance the, like for example, a fireground radio that's within the building? When they key that portable, that's going to come out at 4 watts, 5
Scott, I want to let you know I no longer field engineering questions, so if, I have an engineer down here that might be able to help you with that. No, I totally understand what you're saying. I mean, there is a sort of a game you have to play as far as, because those portables are a lot more powerful than your typical sub 1 watt mobile device. I don't have an answer for you right now. I don't know if someone else on the board might want to chime in, but
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, depending on how much rejection the DAS system has in it in the public safety space. The problem, I think, is even broader than that, is when these two systems are not planned at the same time or in coordination with each other. You have the issue of the downlink of one blocking the uplink of the other just in the transmission without even having a hand radio being keyed. You also have the third order products being generated that fall in the uplink of the others, because the guard band between those two bands is 2 megahertz until all the rebanding gets done. So there's a lot. We've looked at this quite a bit, really triggered by AT&T that we're looking at trying to understand some of this stuff about what the filter requirements really need to be in both systems, because it's not a solution that's solved in one system. It's a solution that has to be solved in the definitioning of the filtering requirements in both systems.
Yeah, and I think we heard that from the Wi-Fi group earlier, basically being able to talk about deploying a Wi-Fi system at the same time as a DAS. And I think as we get into the HETNET forum, I can imagine this session next year will be Wi-Fi, DAS, and fire life safety all at once. But I think the more systems that you can look at the same time, at the same deployment, the better off you are. I think we get into trouble when we're trying to go backwards and try to take an existing Wi-Fi system and then add a DAS or a fire life safety system. I think if we can do them all simultaneously, that's the best. So we're going to move into DAS business models. Doug, I'm going to start with you on the tower funding. So, one of the approaches that we hear about is either the carrier funded, and we've talked a little bit about that today already. But then there's this third-party model that, for lack of better words, called tower funded. And then there's this outright enterprise purchases, and maybe we'll even hear about some new hybrid models, because that sounds kind of interesting as well. But start us off there with the tower funded model. What is it, and kind of what are the key considerations with respect to ownership and long-term obligations?
Okay, thank you. So the third-party model essentially is unlike the carrier model that Teri mentioned, where the carrier is going to fund, and in the case of AT&T, as she identified, typically it's a neutral host system. But third-party, the Crowns and ATCs and many others that are in this room are, as a third party, they're going to construct and operate the DAS or the CWAS, or however you want to define it. And there's a few key elements of what is involved in those third-party models, and they cross over into some of the other two models that we'll talk about, or the hybrids beyond the other two. One is they need a long-term commitment by the venue owner for rights to construct and then operate. And when I say long-term, I mean, I've heard and I've seen in many cases 10-year minimum as an absolute minimum. My own view is for the more complicated or expensive, frankly, systems, 10 years isn't enough. But the number crunchers will confirm that when making that analysis. But as I say, 10 years is pretty much an absolute minimum. And owners need to understand that the telecom infrastructure, I think, like HVAC or other basic building systems, will only get more critical for the operation of their building and their asset as time goes on. So I think we're seeing, from my perspective, an acceptance for the most part of a 10 or maybe 15-year term minimum. But it's something that we struggle with from time to time with owners. Another issue is really the third-party providers really need to time to design, develop a budget for, and then get commitments from at least one, typically anchor tenant or more, because ultimately, without a carrier, DAS systems don't make sense. So what does that mean? sometimes there's some issues regarding whether the third-party provider is going to go out and spend the money to effectively do all the due diligence to make sure that they've got the rights. And sometimes there'll actually be a requirement that they enter into an agreement to maintain those rights, but then they're going to have to make sure that they've got effectively an option, because they've got to sign up those carriers. And on the carrier agreement side with those third-party funding sources and operators, they've got to make sure that that the carriers are fully committed. So one of the things that happens, and we've seen problems with from time to time, is those third-party host providers or funders need to effectively spend the money to design the system. And if they're talking to more than one carrier, there's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of money spent and resources spent, both on the third-party provider side as well as the carrier side, to figuring out a design, particularly in large venues and venues that are complex. And we've seen issues, I've seen issues where carriers aren't quite there in terms of ready from a budgetary perspective to put the dollars in to do that. So owners need to understand, depending on the circumstance, the venue owners, that takes time in many cases. And they need maybe a year, sometimes more than a year, to set that up. So that's another issue that can be a problem that sometimes has to be worked out. The other thing is need assurances from the landlord to allow flexibility in the design. As I mentioned, particularly in the larger venues, more complex venues, landlord, because they have to get those commitments from at least one or more carriers, they've really got to be, the owner that is, has to understand that the design is not always an easy thing. Stadiums is an example, although the carriers, I think, are getting really, and the vendors are really getting good based on experience as to what's going to be required to provide coverage for those 80,000 fans and 3,000 workers on game day. But it's still pretty complex, and the landlord's a key element is understanding that they need to provide flexibility. We heard it referenced by Scott earlier that a lot of venue owners don't want to see the antennas, or they don't have room, or they don't want to make valuable space available for equipment closets and the like. These systems are not, as we all know, not very simple in many cases, and the landlord needs to understand there's got to be flexibility. So the rights that are granted, many times they're not going to be entirely clear up front. Again, it's the timing issue I mentioned before. Typically a third-party developer in particular is not going to be able to spend the money to design the system up front and then say, okay, we're going to go ahead and construct this system, go out to talk to carriers, and then say, does this work for you? Can't work that way. It's got to be a multifaceted collaboration, if you will. Another point I'll mention is performing due diligence as a third-party operator, and this is really the same I think in the carrier model as well. But what are the rights that are going to be granted by the owner? And one thing that folks need to really consider is who is the owner. And I mention this because I've seen it come up on multiple occasions, particularly with large properties, large complex properties, whether they're a stadium or a large office building. There may be various levels of ownership. There may be a ground lease that's owned by a municipality that's then leased out to a team or an affiliate of a team that then may lease or provide a grant of rights to an affiliate or non-affiliate to run concessions. And a lot of times the third-party operator will need to enter into arrangements with the third-party affiliated or non-affiliated entity. So the question is, who are the rights going to be granted from? And again, it's similar to the carrier model, but one that I think is bears mentioning. You got to figure out who you're dealing with and what those rights are, and make sure up front, before you put that money into the design and the effort to get the system up and designed and built, are those rights acceptable? And a lot of times you don't find that out in these complex properties, these complex ownership structures, until very late in the game, which can be a problem.
Yeah, I agree. So and I saw Teri nodding her head a couple of times as well. So Teri, I was reading Carrier and Teri at the same time, sorry. So Teri, so let's not talk about the carrier-specific DAS portion, but you are deploying a lot of neutral host systems, as you say.
Right.
So what's the criteria that you use and the different types of funding models that you go after when working with different properties?
So for AT&T, if it's carrier neutral host, we own the neutral host. So it's we build the whole system, we invest the dollars, we own it, and then we build it, and then we actually have a team, AT&T Towers. We hand it over to AT&T Towers. They solicit to the other carriers, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, et cetera, to attach to the system. How do we determine which ones we want to own and invest our monies in? Multiple things. It's really boils down to the network in that market. So it varies across the country based on our capacity, based on the frequencies, based on the infrastructure we have in that market. So something in Columbia, South Carolina is not going to be important to us as compared to Atlanta. And it could just be two hotels. It could be a Ritz-Carlton Atlanta versus in Columbia. And obviously, based on our network and based on our KPIs and everything in Atlanta, we're going to be more interested in owning and putting that DAS in Atlanta. So we look at, one is the market, what our network is in that market, and that's where we put our dollars, and also who we can hit for the biggest bang for our buck, right? Where can we help and offload our macro network with the most for our biggest dollar?
Is there a Ritz-Carlton in Columbia, South Carolina?
It's just like
So there's money out there, either from a third-party funded source or if it's the right venue from a carrier perspective. But we see different verticals like healthcare being one of them, where the enterprises are going off and purchasing DASs themselves. So Dan, you want to cover that and some of the reasons why an enterprise might want to forego these funding options?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, in the state, I love enterprise DAS solutions. There's nothing better than having a customer just stroke you a check and saying, here you go, here's what you want, do it, what you want to with it, make it the best. And, now I'm not saying that's what always happens, but if anybody out there says they don't like doing enterprise DAS, then and that's in sales, then they're lying. As far as enterprise goes, the benefits of the enterprise solution, at least from the customer perspective, is that you have this control over most of the solution. Does that mean you can do whatever you want? No. You still have accountability to the carriers. You have accountability to, your users on the system. And so, the primary benefits are, even though you have sort of control of the costs, control of what technologies get deployed and what carriers go on the system, you are accountable to, when we deploy our enterprise systems, I have to answer to not just I'm sort of a liaison, right? I have to answer to the customer who has these demands for, data and voice and whatever. And then I also have to be accountable to the carriers. They have a very high standard for, looking through our designs, making sure they meet certain signal criteria, et cetera. So, as far as enterprise goes, it gives you a lot of flexibility as a customer to be able to control the aspects of the design that you want without having a third party come in and tell you what to do. Nothing against the third party guys either. You guys are great. But also you have just that sort of level of control, not just when you initially deploy the solution, but going forward, as the solution gets sort of upgraded over the future, adding new things to it, technology, so on and so forth. So it really lets you sort of whiteboard the idea, if that makes any sense. Like, it's more of a consultative approach as a salesperson when you walk into a customer's location and you say, okay, well, what do you want to do with this? What are your users doing? Where are they going? Are they mobile? Or what kind of devices do they use? What kind of data, et cetera. So it's one of those opportunities where it's literally, you just build it from the ground up, and it's just fabulous. It's one of those exciting things that nerdy guys like me like, is be able to build a solution however you want to. One thing I will say, though, is that as far as when you're trying to use people as a consultant or companies, that you have to take into consideration a lot of things. A level of transparency is very important. Typically, when we're trying to work with an enterprise customer to build a neutral host solution, we're already consulting with the carriers, Teri and her counterparts, long before the deal even closes, just because we want to make absolute certain that that we're being considered and that the carriers approve of what we're doing, et cetera. The biggest things to look out for as far as when you're, I guess, developing an enterprise solution is going to be obviously due diligence. You're going to hear that phrase a lot. You want a company that has a lot of experience deploying Neutro solutions and has the relationships with the carriers. And so our partners, we try to make sure that they have, we have those relationships. And of course, technology-wise, you want to make sure you're deploying a solution that meets the criteria of your Scots, of your, ASG groups, because you want it to be this flexible, modular in the case of some DAS systems, but you basically want to be able to build a platform. It may start off day one as a single carrier, but maybe you want to build it beyond that at a later date. Maybe you want to have everyone on it on the first day. Maybe you want to have it, have new technologies come available, later on that same DAS system. So it gets a little bit complex because you can't always predict every possible option, but it does give you the opportunity to have a little bit more leeway and control over the overall DAS deployment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there are IT organizations out there that say, yep, we've deployed Wi-Fi, we can deploy DAS, and off we go, right?
Absolutely.
So Teri, just to close this out, so obviously, if you decide, hey, as a carrier, we're going to fund a DAS for you, then you connect to it. So when you're trying to connect to a third-party funded model or an enterprise funded model, is there any different considerations you use from a connectivity perspective of just bringing the signal source?
Yeah, so again, just like everybody has said, if we don't own it and a third party wants us to connect, again, it's back to our network and the demand, right, and the financials. So if we have two similar properties, hotels in Atlanta that are similar and they're close to each other in the similar proximity, and we have one third party that wants rent, which I think someone from Verizon said we're getting away from that. That's in this other venue over here who doesn't want rent. That just killed that model, and we're going to choose to go and attach to this other venue and or the capital contribution. I mean, bottom line, we don't have enough to do everything. The demand is so great for DAS now, so everybody's got to put the skin in the game. If the venues want it, and it's not one that we want to own, and it's not one that's high on our priority list, that we're going to build it and take 100% ownership and cost and commitment to it, they're going to have to start getting some skin in the game and share that cost across it, because there's just no way to do them all across the country that everybody wants.
Right. So those are, kind of the three business models that are prevalent today. We started talking about hybrids this morning. Does anybody want to tackle that subject? I didn't think so. So these are hard enough for us today as we start for people that need the DAS. So, but maybe by next time we'll start talking about hybrids. That'd be cool. All right, so we're going to move on to like the RFP, or to doing an RFP and procuring a DAS. So Doug, we're back to you. From a DAS requirements perspective, who's setting the standards for what an RFP looks like? Is it the carriers? Is it the system integrators? Is it the enterprise itself? And do those kind of standards differ from building to building or deployment to deployment?
I think there's sort of shades of gray. My answer to that is, I alluded to it before. There's got to be collaboration. Dan mentioned it a moment ago on the enterprise solutions in a similar circumstance. But ultimately, and I think we heard Teri say it in terms of their limitation on resources, ultimately the carriers are the ones that are going to set the standards. But let me explain that, because some might say, well, how can that be if an enterprise does what Dan described? Unless an enterprise developer owner wants to have a risk that no carriers are going to go on that system, they've got to do what Dan described, his folks do, and he does, which is to collaborate with the carriers. But I just, again, from my perspective, if there's a single answer, it's the carriers drive it. There's a recent, any of you are members of the NetHet Forum, they got last week from the DAS Forum, from Tracy, an email about from the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, or COFAM, and it's an RFP solicitation, and I love it. It's great. It says, and I'm just paraphrasing a few key considerations. They want ubiquitous cell coverage from all major carriers. They prefer a neutral host strongly. They want to be paid for the right to deliver cell services within their buildings and at no cost to them for operation and maintenance. So that's great, and they may get it, and they probably will, but they've got to collaborate. And ultimately, whoever responds to this and who's ever going to be successful to this RFP is not going to go anywhere unless they've got at least one, probably more carriers than one, on board with the concept, on board with the expense, on board with the design, et cetera. So my answer to the question is generally it's the anchor tenant in terms of a carrier who's going to dictate design requirements, specifically with respect to what's going to be involved in terms of what the carrier is going to pay for. I have seen circumstances, by the way, in a couple of different cases around the country, where enterprise, in the context of universities in both cases, that they went out and decided that they were going to go ahead and build it. They designed the system at a fairly significant cost, but there's no carriers that have signed up, and that's now, in one case, 3 or 4 years old. In the other case, it's about 2 years old. So it's real. You got to be careful. They didn't do sufficient homework up front with carriers that were in those markets to ensure that carriers would be willing and had an interest in going on those design systems that were, as designed, if you will. In terms of your question regarding, Kevin, what types of sites or venues, are there some differences? I mentioned universities. Very difficult to deal with because of the setting. Typically, there can be indoor and outdoor and macro sites all as part of a solution. Transit operators, we heard about the Big Dig project in Boston, although it's not a transit operator, but the MBTA in Boston, the New York City metro system, and the like. Same thing in Washington. Those folks oftentimes will dictate not the specifics in terms of design as you experts in this room would necessarily describe it, but in terms of where they want coverage, much the way the museums in San Francisco describe they want ubiquitous coverage everywhere in their buildings. But airports, another good example. They want in the public areas as well as back. I'll call it back of the house for lack of a better term. But in the baggage claim areas and processing areas, cargo areas, parking lots and structures, and the like, there will be oftentimes very specific requirements in terms of general coverage obligations. In buildings, big office buildings, it's not always, from my experience, driven by the enterprise or the building owner, other than perhaps if it's a tenant in a large office building, maybe a headquarters tenant, that says, all right, we want coverage on our 10 or 20 floors of a 40-story building. But I think it can be different in those circumstances. The other thing I'll distinguish from is outdoor DAS from indoor DAS. And I think in outdoor DAS, going to my original point, those are typically almost always carrier-driven, because those are usually an alternative to a macro solution, right? And again, what does that carrier need, or what do those carriers, if it's more than one, need? So again, I think that sort of falls into my initial point, which is it's really ultimately carrier-driven. And I think that's it for now.
Okay. So John, I'll address this question to you, but I mean, Teri, since you're in the driver's seat with respect to requirements, I'll let you jump in as well if you want to. But as far as, so we're going to put together an RFP, and so obviously we've talk to your carrier, understand what some of the requirements are in that region for that carrier. But if you have like just an old building versus new building, what are some of the things that you have to look at, just in those two, that realm of old versus new?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to echo quite a bit what both Dan and Doug said, and I'd like to thank Tracy for sending that RFP out, because that thing was straight from Crazy Town, and it really brightened my day. I just laughed when I read that RFP. My point in saying that is that I see these all the time. The enterprises don't know what they don't know about putting in cellular coverage and capacity in their facilities. And then the worst thing that happens is the enterprise, when they don't know, what do? They hire a consultant. And most of the consultants they hire know Wi-Fi and don't know cellular. So you continue on with the crazy requirements. And ultimately you get these RFPs that say, we'd like DC to daylight and we'd like it for a penny a square foot. Thank you very much, okay? So to Dan's point, I mean, they really need to be able to work with somebody to understand what they really need. And they also have to understand that if they ask for DC to daylight, it's not going to be the same price as if they ask for a single carrier solution, for instance. So the more carriers, the more flexible they need, the more the price tag will go up. So there has to be a test of reasonableness on there. I mean, fundamentally, they absolutely, and I see this all the time, they don't identify what frequencies they want covered. They just say, yeah, I want all the carriers covered. So identification of the frequencies, identification of what the signal strength level needs to be, because if you're in a high rise in Midtown Manhattan, neg 85, it's 95% is not going to cut it, right? But somebody will design that system for them and be shocked when it doesn't work properly, because that's what the specs said. So it's really, you got to be very careful in the way you spec these things up front, and I think there's probably a great business out there for somebody doing nothing but educating enterprises on what it is that they need. As far as building specifics, the kinds of things that you run in building specifics are, of course, you got to worry about what the building materials are. Older buildings tend to have hard pan ceilings, plaster walls with wire mesh in them. You can't get through that with a signal like you can with just a standard piece of drywall. You have to worry about, does the building have high ceilings in it? Because then you're going to need scissor lifts to get up there just to put the antennas in. That's going to raise your cost. What are the access requirements in a facility? DAS vendors, I think we all love airports because they're big, big jobs. We've done a lot of them. We always refer to them as our own private Vietnams once you get in them, because you don't get out for 3 years, and they're very, very expensive to do because of the access and security requirements in there. And then you run into old airports. Anybody been in JFK? It's like being in a third world airport, where all of a sudden you find out you got to do asbestos abatement and those kinds of things. So that's the other thing you need to worry about. The other issue is, what are the local building codes? Does it require a conduit? Anybody ever done a job in Las Vegas? Everything's got to go in conduit. Right away, your costs are going to go up 50% having to put conduit in. What are the existing cable infrastructure in there? Can you use what's already there? Because that'll cut your cost quite a bit, because as we all know, sitting in this room, 50% of the cost of deploying a DAS is cable and install cost. So that's always helpful as well. And I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, there's a lot to be considered when you look at what the requirements are for a DAS in terms of its design and what it's going to do in terms of meeting the needs of the end user or the enterprise, and then also be concerned about all the ups and extras you may run into while you're out there trying to deploy the system.
So, and to add on to that, so AT&T very rarely in most areas in the market in the country are using BDAs. I mean, we're pretty much going all BTSs. Small cell will be playing a role here in the future. We'll see how that pans out. But right now, it's pretty much BTSs, very rarely BDAs. So that is now really part of our macro network and our infrastructure. So access is very important. We want to be able to get to it 24/7, 365 for, PMs or routine maintenance, or if we do see, an alarm, so that the field engineers can access it. And the other thing to educate them, just for us to attach on the simplest DAS, single sector, for us to buy that RF equipment to attach, we're looking 70 to 80K just for that RF equipment. So you're not even considering the backhaul and the electricity, right? So just for that RF equipment, just to connect, for me to order that equipment, 70 to 80K for a single sector DAS. So then you multiply that when you get to a much larger DAS, more sectors. So it's not cheap, and so we have to buy that, and then if they want money, and then they want rent, and they want capital, well, their ROI went down. We move on and go to the next venue who's more cooperative, and again, puts that skin in the game.
Great. So, all right. So we're seeing RFPs that aren't meeting, or we're having to teach the enterprise how to spec an RFP. I know we get these a lot. They're the form of a Division 27 spec. So Matt, what is a Division 27 spec? And then, kind of is it really the best way for us as an industry to move forward, or enterprises to move forward in purchasing a DAS?
I guess from my point, enterprise is very challenging to us because I see there's two types of people out there going out and doing these enterprise DAS. There's those who do daily work with the carriers. They're up to speed with what the carriers' requirements are, what their needs are, and then there's the other ones that are just mainly serviced in the enterprise space. And a lot has happened in the last 3 to 4 years in the carrier space. They've put a lot of resources, have implemented a lot of standards, got a lot smarter, and are forcing discipline into a space that really had no discipline prior to that. And so if you're not working with the carrier on a day-to-day basis, you don't know what you don't know. And that makes it difficult to compete when you do know what the carriers want, because if you do work for them, you'll never be able to get away with putting out a response that's not compliant to their needs. Otherwise, it would jeopardize your bread and butter business. But that now you're competing with somebody who doesn't necessarily work with the carriers, doesn't really know what the changes are. And with ASG, these changes have come fast and furious over the last couple of years. And these RFPs, they're written so broadly like this. It says nothing about capacity. It says nothing about signal levels. It says nothing about SINAR. It has nothing to be able to have an evaluation done other than on a beauty contest of what you claim that you will give back to them. And so it also makes a lot of these things very protracted because the carriers aren't going to go ahead and sign up to terms and sign up to systems that aren't right. So, this creates, for a company like us, we both function as a systems integrator and equipment supplier. So as a systems integrator, it makes for a very uneven playing field. And as a product supplier, our products go out to other companies through various channels, and it's a hard time to control the integrity of the implementations that go out there because we lose control over the end product. So I think there's got to be a lot more work here, and I think maybe this comes down to the carriers as well, is to put standards out that are clear that you will not connect to our system unless you meet these specific guidelines and standards.
Great. So assuming we make it through the RFP process, Doug, one more time over to you. Are there any key contractual elements that people should consider, assuming that they're ready to buy the DAS and sign a contract?
Yeah, I think let's assume then that what we're talking about is the RFP has been awarded, and in the context of maybe I'll start with a third-party funding scenario or model. Typically, they're going to require, or the contract is going to require the third-party funding entity to pay for design, construction, and implementation or commissioning of the system, and that risk is on the third-party provider. There's also going to need to be, typically at the contract stage, in my experience, a walkaway if there isn't an anchor tenant signed up to commit. But usually, although not always, that anchor tenant is signed up, so that by the time the ink is signed on the contract with the venue owner, they've got someone committed. But again, there's a period where design and final design and details need to be put together. And beyond that, then, how is it paid for? Yes, the upfront capital is the commitment or obligation of the third-party provider, but the anchor tenant and subsequent tenants, that is the carriers, will share typically in that capital contribution, typically on a pro rata basis, although with additional. And what does that mean? Well, if there's two carriers, you split it 50-50. If there's three, it's 1/3 each. But it can get more complex depending on what frequencies and services are going to be provided over that DAS if it's multi-layer. So you can carve it up differently in more detail, which in my view gets entirely too complicated, because then the question is, what about future technology? Who pays or who's obligated to pay and to use that that expansion, if you will, for 4G, 5G, and beyond. But again, the reimbursement for pro rata cost, and then is one issue, and then another issue, which is a key term, is going to be what about ongoing maintenance, monitoring and repair, and again, that's typically equally shared. I haven't seen that carved up other than in by the number of users on the system, and that goes to for example, the AT&T model Teri described, where they're involved in neutral host. So there's really not too much in the way of differences if it's a single carrier investment or single carrier system in terms of those key terms. The other thing I mentioned it, the commissioning of the system, testing and acceptance. There's usually very detailed terms around, particularly when a third-party operator, around what it is, when that commitment, when the acceptance is going to be required, and when it needs to be given, so that the third-party provider knows that that commitment now from the carrier or carriers is going to turn into cash and a reimbursement. Those are some of them, but there's many more.
Yeah.
How much time do I have?
None.
Probably not enough.
Gordon.
So, all right. So let's switch gears one more time and then start talking about installation and what happens after installation. So, one of the players that we haven't really talked about too much is the system integrator. So, John, what does the system integrator do, and what are some of the key things that make them a qualified system integrator?
Well, I think the SI is much beyond installation, because the SI should actually be working directly with whoever the end user is, the enterprise, to determine all those things that we've already talked about in the last hour. So figure out, what do they need from carrier support? Single carrier, multiple carriers? How many users are going to be on this system? Is it just their employees? Are going to have roaming users? What's the voice data split to try to figure out what the capacity requirements for that system are? Are they going to need, the latest, and provide support for LTE, for instance? So they need to do all of that. Then they also need to go ahead and understand what the requirements are from a building perspective, as we've already discussed, to be able to do at least a budgetary quote on that. Obviously, and to Matt's point, there's a lot of places you can go and source a DAS today from lots of distribution and things like that. That's all well and good, but you ought to be certified on being able to actually not only install that DAS system, but actually design for it, because DAS systems vary in terms of their design requirements. So one size doesn't fit all. It's not cookie cutter, and you should know how to design with whatever that DAS solution is that you've chosen. And of course, a key role for the system integrator also is to basically broker the arrangement or the relationship with the carriers in conjunction with the enterprise IT staff. So work with the carriers, get approval for the DAS, get approval for the design, and up front, a carrier's agreement to go on the system, because as I think Doug mentioned, and I've seen it myself, I've seen multiple instances where enterprises have put DASs in, and then the carrier has not decided to go on that system, either because it didn't meet their design requirements or it didn't meet their ROI. And the enterprise at the end of the day is left with that bill for that DAS, and it's not getting done what they need it to get done. So absolutely critical, though, for the system integrator to be certified by the OEM, by the DAS provider, and also certified by IB-Wave, because IB-Wave has become the de facto standard from a design perspective. Everybody uses IB-Wave, and they should be certified in how to use IB-Wave.
Okay, so Matt, then if we go through kind of design, install, commissioning, optimization, what do those steps really mean? And then, what are some of the gotchas that you can experience along the way?
John mentioned about IB-Wave. There's various packages of IB-Wave. There's a basic package, or the propagation package, and then there's the optimization package. And depending on what type of venue you have, a lot has changed in the design standpoint from the days of NEG 85, DBM, RSSI. It's become about signal and interference ratio. It's come about minimizing the handover areas in designs. So, in small enterprises, typically one sector, but in some of these other venues where there's large number of sectors, there's really taking time to the design and antenna selections and design details to make sure that you minimize the handover areas. And that really requires the optimization module. So it does require a higher level of investment, and not everybody has made that investment and is able to do that. The second thing that's critical too, I think, is to understand whether you're designing a system for CISO or MIMO, or is it ultimately going to be upgraded to MIMO? Because I think one of the things that's overlooked a lot is the signal to interference, the SINAR that's required to really support MIMO. You can get by with a smaller, the degradation and the SINAR requirements for CISO are much less than they are for MIMO if you really want to exploit the doubling of throughput for MIMO. So there does take some discipline in the design aspects to do it properly. Then we get into the installation aspect. There is still a lot of suppliers out here, I think Scott alluded to it, that just are incapable of putting out quality installations. Although, I mean, with the uptick in this business, it's attracted everybody who's done outdoor sites, everybody who's done structured cabling wants to come in and become an installer in this space. And PIM has become, has been, but is an issue in these venues. So the installation is critical. The quality of the installation is critical to be able to get everything that you want out of the DAS. The same thing applies to the fiber. I mean, we've seen cases where even OTDR measurements don't always pinpoint fiber issues. And that takes more complex testing. When we get into a commissioning standpoint, these systems, as they get into multi-operators, get much more combinations than they did when they have the single operator. And leveling these systems has much more degree of variability because of tolerance buildups of how we bring all these different operators together. And leveling the system is one area that a lot of shortcuts are taken, and the system's not fully leveled. And so there's lost performance in the leveling of these systems. Once again, if you're doing MIMO, the path balance between MIMO paths is critical for some of the algorithms to work depending on the base stations they are. Some base station manufacturers are much more intolerant of amplitude imbalance between one path versus the other path. And so we see a lot of care much more care has to be done now in the commissioning of the system to make sure it's fully leveled properly. And then the optimization phase, that's really going back and trying, IB Wave is a great tool, but it's a prediction, so you have to go and it assumes that your antennas are sited in a certain orientation and the patterns are not affected by the venue. So the optimization phase is a time-consuming phase of making sure that you're tweaking your antenna point angles, you're adjusting your power levels to get that. This all takes experience. To do these things, and the most important part is it takes time and it takes experienced resources. And that's what we've been trying to focus our energies on, is how to try to take some of this expertise out of it and try to take some of this time out of it by automating some of these processes with the equipment itself.
Great, but it still need a good system integrator today. All right, Teri, so I like this. Okay. Yeah, we're almost out of time, and last couple topics, and then we'll be done.
Yeah, do the last couple topics.
Okay. So just I like the statement that says that there's no use of a DAS if a carrier is not connected. So so we hear a little bit about carrier coordination. I mean, what's really involved in carrier coordination, and who really needs to be involved?
So the way we look at it, it's who owns the DAS, right? So hopefully it's, if it's the tower company, ATC, Crown, or if it's a venue, it's going to be, hopefully they have an integrator. So it's going to be one of those that'll be working with the carriers to connect to that DAS. As someone mentioned earlier, we own the spectrum. So we own that spectrum, so there either has to be a transmission agreement or we have to bring our BTS in, and it needs to be integrated with our macro network so there's no interference and it doesn't cause any problems with our macro network.
Okay, perfect. And the very last topic, when we'll go into as many questions that Tracy will let us answer, but maintenance. So everyone, or most of these systems have the ability to monitor them and maintain them and all of those kind of things. I guess really the question is, Dan, and I'll throw this to you, is should a DAS be monitored? Should it be recertified on a regular basis? What are your thoughts on those kind of topics?
All right, I'll try to keep this short and sweet. If you would have asked me 5-10 years ago, there would have been a younger, fitter Dan Harkness here on stage. But I would have told you no, that really systems don't need to be monitored unless they're really like a larger scale type solution. Nowadays, I feel like the trend's going in the opposite direction, especially at ADRF. I know we're focusing a lot more on that sort of long-term customer acceptance as well as our relationship with the carriers. So with that said, and the more reliable systems out there to enable a maintenance knocking capability, and it's not just knocking. You need to be able to put in SLAs in place that your customer says, okay, well, if you're monitoring the system and you're knocking it, well, it doesn't matter if an alarm goes off if there's no one there to show up. So I mean, I think that as far as my opinion on that, maintenance and knocking, absolutely. We have an agreement at AMP that we put forth in front of a lot of customers to help sort of better our relationship with the carrier and with the customer in order to have that ongoing maintenance and monitoring ability. And as far as the PMing, we do initiate typically a yearly preventive maintenance, as well as we'll throw in other extras as well to make sure that the system is going to maintain over the long haul. So.
All right, and with that, we'll head to
You know what? I
questions.
think we have to wrap it up to be mindful of our exhibitors, but I'm sure these guys will stay up here
Sure.
for a couple minutes and talk to you. We'll meet back here at 4 o'clock for the case study of the walkthrough for the French Quarter, and then we're going to tour a couple. We'll go in different groups. We're going to tour a couple DAS nodes and end up at a wonderful reception on Bourbon Street.